Okay, so today we're talking about the Russian period in Afghanistan, but gosh, we really have to review a little bit of the Russian history. As some of you experienced with us, we spent 7 hours on the development of Russia from the Vikings to the present. So I just really feel the need to go back and review that in a very short fashion, I hope. So we can get our context and our perspective. So we've talked last week about Russia pushing south and taming the steppes all the way to the Afghan border. So, but when I was looking at that whole excursion through all these periods of expansion here, the different color codes, my distractibility kicked in. And here's the Ukraine, and the Ukraine is so much in the news. I'm going to take a little Ukraine tangent and just point out that the Ukraine joined Russia in this red expansion, which this map lists from the late 1600s to 1801. And so here you see Kiev joins Russia. Before, Kiev was not part of Russia. The Ukraine, as we know it, was not a part of Russia. Here's Crimea here, here's the Black Sea. It's a little bit disoriented because the map's tilted, but this is the Black Sea, so orient yourself. Here's the Crimea, and here's Moscow, and here's Kiev. Not until the late 1600s. Well, let's look at that. What happened in Kiev before then? So in one of our sessions, we talked about how the Vikings came down and created the Kiev Dynasty. And that's a long story. You can look it up in the index of all our talks and go through it again, Shigeko, if you want to. I don't think you were with us then. So they got started in 862, a long time ago. And they extended all the way up to the north and all the way down to the Black Sea from Kiev. And what interrupted their time were the Mongols. So the Mongols came roaring in and eventually got to the Black Sea and absolutely wiped out the Kievan dynasty. So Kiev falls. The Mongols keep going further west to Hungary. And the Mongols were pretty harsh rulers. If you resisted, they would chain you underneath a table and have a big meal sitting on top of you if you did not submit. And the Russian boyars did not submit willingly. Who were the boyars? They were the descendants of the Vikings. Boyar, Viking. That's who the boyars were, and they were the aristocracy. it was really a feudal system that the Vikings set up. So being Vikings, they didn't submit. But the Mongols were fierce warriors, as we know. And I wonder if you all can name another fierce Altaic warrior civilization. Are you ready for the reveal?
Yep.
The other one is Japan.
Huh.
The samurai. Think of that. They're
Altaic?
They're Altaic. Here we go. Over here.
Oh.
Japonic languages sometimes included. All right. So I'm going to run with that. And I'm sure there's controversy around languages and what's what. But that's just an irresistible connection for me to make. The Altaics were pretty fierce warriors. And when you think about the Turkic Khanates and how they resisted the Russians as they spread into Siberia, their reputation is well deserved. All right, so here's a map, and this is the aftermath of the Mongols. They persisted and set up what were known as Khanates. And the Khanate that ruled the Kiev territory was called the Golden Horde. So these are still Mongols. And even today, you have Mongol civilization, Mongol citizens around the Black Sea. I met one. He was a docent in a museum that we attended while babysitting last week. And he heard one of my grandkids call me Opa. And he said, wait a minute, what language is that? I said, German. And he started talking to me in German. And it turns out he was a Tatar. So that's what the descendants of the Mongol horde were called. And so where did he learn to speak German? He learned to speak German in Istanbul. And you'll remember that the Turks allied with the Germans in World War I. So his family, as descendants of the Golden Horde, ended up in Istanbul, and he learned to, by tradition, learned to speak German. And here he and I were speaking German. And I pulled the grandkids over because I've done a little bit of history with them. And I said, here's a descendant of Genghis Khan. And his eyes lit up, and my grandkids' eyes lit up. And so it was good. Yeah, the Golden Horde still have a legacy even today around the Black Sea. So where is Moscow on the map? It's nowhere because it didn't exist. There were some warlords around this river system, which becomes Moscow, but nothing to speak of. And the warlords had to pay tribute to the Golden Horde. So Moscow was just a little podunk tributary that didn't even make it onto the map. I want you to notice a couple of things before we go on to the next map. Lithuania and Poland, they will eventually merge and create the largest country in Europe called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Not yet, but keep an eye on them. They're going to be interesting, what's going to happen. Another thing I want to point out is Galatia. Galatia. I know an awful lot of immigrants from Europe who are Jewish, and their ancestors came from Galatia, and they wound up immigrating to Vienna. There's a whole line of very successful Viennese Jews that come from Galatia. My college roommate, who became a history professor, traced his ancestry back to Galatian Jews. And why were Jews in Galatia? Because Poland eventually controlled that area and hired Jews to manage the finances of their land holdings. And that's later on with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The other thing I want to point out to you is the Habsburgs. So we spent 2 or 3 sessions talking about the evolution of the Habsburgs, who are a little Swiss warlord at one point, who grew and grew, fought the Hungarians and conquered them. So thus you later get the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the other thing they did is they married all over Europe. They married in Holland, they married in Spain, and the Habsburgs ruled Europe for a long period of time. And if you want a review of that, go to our index, because we decided at that time the Habsburgs were so important that we would start at the beginning and keep going to the collapse of the Habsburgs, which didn't happen until World War I. So we decided to create a thread, a structure that we could hang our hats on as we talked about Europe, and it was very, very useful. But here they are, just a little dinky region in around the 1300s. Okay, so now that we've got a sense of what's happening in the 1300s, just notice that there is no Kiev. It's not even on the map. And the only thing that existed were some refugees from the old Kiev Dynasty that maybe joined some Russian principalities. The next thing that happens in 1320, what happens? The Lithuanians come down to Kiev, and they conquer Kiev. And eventually, this Grand Duke joins into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Kiev stays in that Commonwealth until 1654. That's a long time. And it closes any expansion of Russia to the south and to the east. So this is just showing the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And they controlled most of the Ukraine. There's a little sliver in the eastern part of the Ukraine that the Russians culturally dominated. And guess what? That split is still there today, and it's on the front pages of our newspapers, and it's aggravating Putin enormously. That Europe, as he perceives it, has control an area that has culturally been Russian, and the language is mostly Russian. So it's just a perfect example how going through your history, you get a lot of light shed on current problems. So my point here is that the central and western Ukraine were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, were totally European for 348 years. So the question is, what caused the Red expansion? How were the Russians able to expand into the Ukraine? And what happened was the Cossacks. So the Cossacks are started off as cowboys, basically. Imagine a militarized group of cowboys out west, and they're basically warlords. They're very warlike, and they launched an uprising in 1648 against Poland, Lithuania, and they grabbed the eastern part of the Ukraine and then expanded into the central part of the Ukraine, and they formally fell into the hands of Russia in 1654. I mentioned earlier that the Jews had been deployed by the Poles to manage their estates, and the Cossacks harbored bitter resentment from being managed on the estates of the Poles by the Jews. So I'm sure there's many sources of anti-Semitism, but this is one. And we hear about Cossacks raiding Jewish villages as late as the late 1800s in the pogroms. And so there's a formal ceremony in which the Cossacks pledge allegiance to the Tsar. This is in 1654. It was so important that on the 300th anniversary, they celebrated this joining of the Ukraine to Russia, and their native son, Khrushchev, he was Ukrainian. On that occasion, he had all the power, so he transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet, the Russian state, to the Ukrainian Soviet, the Russian state. And that was going to have consequences in 1991 when Ukraine became an independent country possessing the Crimea, which had for 300 years been Russian. So let's do the math. Kiev was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Western European, for 348 years. But under the Cossack warlords, they proclaimed fealty to the Russians from 1654 to 1991 when communism fell. Well, that's 337 years. And it's even less if you subtract the years after the Russian Revolution, when Russia had no power to control the Ukraine, and Ukraine declared its independence. And then there was a big war. Some people would call it a civil war. Some people would call it a war of independence from the Ukrainian side. But there you are. And this background information, I think, is relevant for what we're reading on the front pages of the newspapers. All right, so enough of the red expansion. Let's fast forward to Alexander the First and the yellow expansion here. And you can see the Russians went along the north shore of the Black Sea and took Azerbaijan, which has a lot of oil. Oil at the time they took it didn't mean much, right? Before the combustion engine, but obviously it would. And they took Georgia at that time. So when Stalin is born, he's born into Russia. And also on Alexander the First watch, there were some big events. What city is burning? I'll just hesitate for a moment, let you commit to yourself. That is Moscow. And it's burning because the Russians set it on fire. So this guy couldn't take any sustenance from it. And when Napoleon saw there were no spoils, no food, nothing for him, he realized he was in big trouble. And the French army lost 90%, maybe more, of their troops trying to get back to Europe in the Russian winter. What did Alexander the First do? He led a successful coalition that faked out Napoleon and conquered Paris. So instead of the French conquering Moscow, the Russians conquered Paris. And here he is, the Arc de Triomphe, Alexander the First, the Tsar of Russia. And what a boost to self-confidence that was. If we can defeat Napoleon, we can do a lot of stuff. So they started looking south, and the problems that they were having on their southern border with these Altaic aggressive tribes. But Nicholas the First adds Kazakhstan. They're on the front page of the newspapers now, and they're calling the leaders there, the corrupt leaders there, are now calling on the Russians to come in and help them. So Russia is trying to extend its tentacles back into the Turkey areas that they lost in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And they may have to help their allies, the warlords, the oligarchy in Kazakhstan stay in power and may not have enough troops to invade the Ukraine. So a couple of headline stories come together, and if we know our history, it makes it even more interesting. So that was the big acquisition of Nicholas the First, and he integrates Samarkand in Uzbekistan, and he looks at Kiev, which is also in Uzbekistan. And this was the center of the white slave trade, you'll remember. What a motivation. We've got on our southern border Turks coming in and kidnapping our population, men and women, and selling them into slavery. And we know from Ramsey that some of that slave trade got to as far as Venice. It had been started by the Mongols. Here's a summary of the years of the victory. Ramsey shared this with me when Russia was on a roll. They got Tashkent and Uzbekistan, Samarkand and Bukhara in Uzbekistan, Khiva in Uzbekistan. And the toughest were the Turkomans, and Ramsey's going to visit that battlefield this summer. So we'll hear all about it. Now let's fast forward to Alexander II, and he's the blue. So he got he got Uzbekistan. He got some other places, Vladivostok, approaching Japan, and took some of these islands away from Japanese fishermen. And let's just look at Alexander III and what he added in orange. You'll notice one of the acquisitions was Pameer. Well, this gets us back to our topic, right? Afghanistan. And I'll talk about that in just a second, a little bit more. But in 1862, the Russians had a big celebration. This wasn't a 300-year, this was an 1,000-year celebration, because now they're feeling confident enough under Alexander II to say, you know what, our Russian history really started with Kiev. They've only been under our power for, at that point, 200 years. But they were, Kiev was founded, we're culturally Russian, and we claim that that's when Russia was started, even though there was no Moscow to speak of until Ivan the Terrible in 1500. So this nationalism and claiming an expansive area isn't just Vladimir Putin making up stuff. This is in the Russian history and in their myth. As I've said many times before, it matters most what people believe. And this is the myth that they believe, and it would be enough to take them to war in certain circumstances. And we have to understand that. The myth was enough to carry the Germans into war. That's for damn sure. So the Pameer acquisition, it's a river valley, and it was very much part of the Silk Road. What we're going to be discussing, we'll be talking about the Pameer Valley. By the way, Marco Polo went through the Pameer Valley on his way to China. So very relevant there. And the Russian Empire expanded and took the Pameer Valley in the Great Game. So it didn't really belong to Afghanistan, or Afghanistan couldn't control it. So it was the Pameer Valley was Russian. But as we said before, the Great Game ended in 1907. Both the Russians and the British were distracted. The British with the Germans, the Russians with having lost a war to the Japanese, and were experiencing revolutions already in 1907. And so they called it off. They had the conference in the Pameer Valley. That's where they met, because this was one of the places of contention. And they compromised. They both said, okay, let's just neutralize the Pameer Valley, not fight over it anymore. It looks like with the combustion engine, it's not going to be as important. With trains, it's not going to be as important as it used to be with the Silk Road. let's just both withdraw and give it to Afghanistan. And they did. And that was part of their the deal that ended the Great Game. And here, I just thought I'd throw in a few pictures of the Pameer Valley. So, very rugged, but not exclusively. There's a big water source. Here's a smaller water source. Here it's fertile enough that you can survive in the Pameer Valley. And there was a Tajik warlord that held out during against the Taliban and centered his movement here. Masood, a very dynamic and charismatic leader who bin Laden knew had to be taken care of, and he was assassinated on September 10th, the day before 9/11, because bin Laden knew all hell was going to break loose, and he didn't want Masood, the loose cannon, getting in his way. So as part of the British-Russian compromise, they drew a line in mostly Iran, and said, okay, this will be your sphere of influence. The Iranians are weak, and this will be our sphere of influence. The Baluchs and the Pashtuns are weak. And that's the way the Great Game ended. There's a lot of lines here. It's just the blue line I wanted you to see. So sure enough, World War I comes. Russia has its revolutions, and they lose the South. They lose all these Turkic khanates that they had spent so long pursuing and folding them into their empire. And this is in the Fergana Valley, which is in Uzbekistan. We've heard about it repeatedly. But the Russian revolutionaries, they came in and they said, we got a plan. We understand technology. We can bring you wealth. And I think when these areas were part of the empire, they enjoyed the benefits of being part of an empire. Being part of an empire is not all bad. You get increase in trade and communication, and they were able to, even though the early days of the revolution, and they were fighting a war against the white Russians who were against the revolution, they were able to cajole all of the Turkic khanates to rejoin Russia, this time as states, as Soviets. Back in communist Russia. It was quite an achievement, and Ramsey promised me he was going to investigate more about how they pulled it off. But they pulled it off in the Uzbekistan for sure, and then the other areas as well. And this is the Fergana Valley, which we've stumbled on many times, a very fertile valley surrounded by mountains. And so,
excuse me. So does that mean that those stand countries join Russia, but in a peaceful way, negotiating and all of this, instead of being conquered?
Well, I don't think it was always peaceful. I'm sure it wasn't. But they did enjoy the benefits of being part of the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, of being part of a larger empire. they had enjoyed some benefits from joining in the Russian Empire that was run by the Tsars. And they kind of remembered that. And so here you have all these countries at different times joining. And so Kazakhstan didn't join until 1929. And it took a while for the Tajiks to come in. But where it was not peaceful and happy was in the Baltic countries that Aiko and I visited: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They did not have happy memories of life under the Tsars. They were very strong and proud and nationalistic, and Russia had to use force on many occasions to suppress these people, and Poland. Now, Poland was able to maintain its independence for a while after World War I, became a new nation, or a reconstituted nation. They had been divided by the major powers for 150 years. The old joke is, hey, we're in power, let's divide Poland. And so for the first time in about 150 years, at the end of World War I, they became a nation, as did Czechoslovakia, and Hungary as well. So that wasn't all peaceful. And and Russia didn't really seize them back until 1940. They had all been, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and all been, along with Poland, independent countries in the interwar years. Just a review: key dates in the Russian spread south, because Afghanistan is their last attempt to spread south. That's why it's relevant. 862 was the founding of Kiev. 1547, Ivan the Terrible emerges, 700 years after Kiev has been established, and puts Moscow on the map. Moscow really is just a tributary to the Mongols until this time. And he says to the Mongols, no more tribute. But look, it had lasted 300 years as a tributary to the Mongols. And then, as we said, Kiev defects from Lithuania, Poland. This date has actually been moved back to 1654, sorry. Alexander conquers Paris instead of Napoleon conquering Moscow. They celebrated that 1,000-year celebration in 1862, reinvigorating a myth that Kiev is part of Russia. The end of the Great Game, which is relevant for Afghanistan. They get the Pameer Valley and less meddling in their affairs between the great European powers. There'd always been meddling in Afghanistan affairs. It's the Great Game was just the meddling of European powers. And obviously 1917, the Russian Revolution, they lost the South, but slowly captured the South and made them Soviet states. And they fought in World War II. The Altaic peoples, the Turkic peoples, Mongolian people. I remember there's a picture at the end of World War II, near Dresden, at the Elbe River, where American forces meet the Russian forces after totally wiping out Germany and destroying Dresden. And I remember from those celebratory photos of Russian soldiers and American soldiers hugging and dancing and drinking, that there were Asian faces among the Russian soldiers. So these Soviet, Turkey, Mongolian population stayed loyal to Mother Russia and fought the Germans. I'm sure not everybody did, but many did. And then now we're up to 1979, which is what I'm some of you were expecting me to start with, but I thought that we needed to do this review.
Tony, could I ask you one thing?
Sure.
In my Jewish history class, they said the Tsar pushed all the Jews to Eastern Europe. What timeline was that in this thing?
So that I suppose would be to protect them from the Cossacks, to use their skills and their administrative abilities in the new Turkic, Altaic states. We met a girl at a party who was Jewish, who was born in Kazakhstan. So there was that. And so I guess I'd place that with Stalin getting ready for World War II. I don't know that there was any strategic movement of the Jews under the Tsar, but I'd be glad to look at that to see if the Tsars had a strategic goal in mind. If you could get me more information on that, Shigeko, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, yeah, it was a documentary we saw in the Jewish history class. So
I'd love to know more if the Tsars deployed the Jews strategically.
okay.
So this gets us back after this long review and diversion on Ukraine in the news, and to where we left off, which was this ruthless Afghani communist who was going too far, even for the Soviets and their secret police, and they assassinated him. And that was after he had assassinated one of the Soviet favorites. So it was a real mess, and the Russians decided, we're going to have to take matters into our own hands, and they invaded, and it was commemorated. I put the name Sam up here because he was a co-worker at the hospital, and we would meet at the Xerox machine in the old days. And he had been a communist and worked in the communist bureaucracy at a time when moderate, if you can call a communist moderate communists in Afghanistan without the brutal Amin were trying to nation build. And he had worked in the post office. And we talked at the time of after 9/11 when we invaded Afghanistan, and I said to Sam, well, look, we're going to go in and there'll be a lot of money and maybe we'll nation build. And he said, no, you won't. And he was right. So they installed this guy, Karmal. We've talked about him. And the Russians came in support of Karmal. And this was their strategy. They took the ring road. So, right, there's this, now there's a ring road. And if you're going to nation build, you gotta have a road. If you're going to make this a nation, that you've got to have a way of getting from place to place. So the Russians put effort into the ring road. I think the monarchy before had put investment in the ring road, as did the socialist reformers afterwards. So this ring road is always the problem with a ring road, is that you can't always defend it, and it's pretty easy if you've got a group of a group of rebels up in the mountains to come down and just block the ring road. And
that's what happened in Afghanistan, because we also built up that ring road. But the thing is, they kept bombing it.
Yep. So it's very vulnerable. They also had an air bridge where they flew in a lot of supplies to Kabul, as did we. We got a lot of supplies to Kabul through Pakistan, because they were nominally our allies opposing. But when we were in control, all our supplies came from the Indian Ocean up through Pakistan, through the Khyber Pass and into Peshawar, and then into Kabul. Off we go. Russian soldiers just look like any other soldiers. They captured Mujahideen early on. They were successful. Tanks made it all the way to Kabul, and they were more modern than even the Afghan republic had been. Remember, there was an iteration of republic still being run by the royal family, and then a socialist reforming member of the royal family took over and added reforms. But the Russians took it even further. And so you talk about girls getting an education. This is what Sam told me. The tragedy was, he had been part of, working at the post office, has been part of a regime that was really trying to modernize and nation build. But they were opposed by the same types of people who opposed us. Religious fundamentalists. And they fought the Russians tooth and nail, getting practice on how they'd fight us. They captured Russian equipment just like they captured our equipment. They had many different Mujahideen forces. They were, Carol, as fragmented, probably along tribal lines, as Afghanistan has always been. And here's just a list of all the different types of rebel organizations. Same old problem. But they were united in one way, the co-religionists, and that overcame some of the tribal divisions. And equipment made in America got to the Mujahideen to fight the Russians. Our Remember, the Cold War is still going on. We're fighting communists, we think. And if you want to see a good movie about this, Charlie Wilson's War, he was an American congressman who took the lead and made sure that our CIA got money from us, from the Saudis. This is a German schematic, and got the money. These are all the different militias, Mujahideen, and a lot of countries were involved, anti-communist countries, and even the intelligence service in Pakistan was coordinating this. So everybody was on board, and the Mujahideen were invited into the Oval Office. We're not talking about Taliban yet. This is Mujahideen, garden variety. And this is the real guy that Tom Hanks plays, Charlie Wilson, who was hands-on. They were sending a lot of weapons over, so he picked up one and joined the locals for this photo op. And we weren't alone in protesting the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. There were a lot of European protests against the Soviets. So the Geneva Peace Accords made an arrangement for the Soviets to leave. It was a fig leaf, but they left. They're waving goodbye. There's a stamp commemorating it. That was a contrast to coming in. And here's the last Soviet to leave, rather orderly when you compare our leaving of Afghanistan. This is a father and son team with flowers walking over to Uzbekistan. That day is still commemorated, even when we were occupying Afghanistan. That day is against the Soviets is celebrated as a victory day. I'll finish with this point. The Geneva Accords propose to make Afghanistan a buffer state within the Soviet sphere of influence, sure, but a buffer state that would be demilitarized and allow a left-wing government to control and continue to try to build a modern state. But we opposed it. We washed our hands, walked away, and would not support any kind of Russian influence in there. And the book that I've recommended, The Pashtun Question, says that what happened was any chance of a modernization died with that abandoning Afghanistan. And there was a total destruction of a century of modernization. The leftists that they left behind ruled for 4 years, for 3 or 4 years. And he was eventually overthrown by Karmal, who came back. So it was a failure, just like we failed to nation build for the same reasons. And 100 years were lost. That started really with the Iron Emir that we talked about in previous sessions. He was the one who started building a modern state in Afghanistan. And you'll remember his family. He was the nephew. And so I am going to start next time with the second topic that I got diverted on, and that's the new Silk Road, that the Soviet retreat from and the collapse of the Turkic Soviets allows, instead of north-south trade with the Soviet Union, now there is a possibility for a very strong east-west trade. And this is where we're going to start next time. Erdogan's dream looks like it's coming true. The last piece that he needed to add took place in the fight in Nagorno-Karabakh between the Armenians and the Azerbaijans, and that's where we'll start next time. The new possibilities in Azerbaijan for a full, uninterrupted link to China. And ironically, the link would be include Urumqi, where the Uyghurs are being persecuted. All right, so there's your cliffhanger for next time. I'll stop sharing and I'll ask if there's any questions. I can take questions.
Can I just make a statement?
Yes.
Okay, it just occurred to me that, you were saying that Russia has to have Kiev because that was the beginning of the Russian Empire. The thing is, though, those people in the Ukraine, in the northern part in particular, they're more white. And I mean, Russia's ancestry was the Vikings, coming down the Volga River. And so that's why Putin and all these guys look white. Whereas the people down below, they're Turkic, Altaic peoples, and they're Asians, basically, So maybe he wants Kiev because this is their way of, he's had so much trouble with all those Turkic peoples, that he wants to align all the white people together. What do you think?
Well, I think he wants everything. I think he would love to recreate a multi-ethnic empire. I don't think I don't think that's his motivation for the Ukraine. He wants it all, and he's working pretty darn close now with the Chinese. And I think he's ceding a lot of power to the Chinese, economic power to the Chinese in this new Silk Road, which I'll talk about next time. So I don't see him. I see the positive. I agree with the positive idea of adding back the Ukraine, which is culturally and ethnically closer to the Russians, but I don't see him doing that because he wants to turn his back on the Turkic.
Well, he's not going to turn his back on those people because the thing is, there's so many rich natural resources in the South, and he's not going to give that up. But will, I mean, he'll put, you know, just like Stalin put all the white guys in charge, you know, when they took in all of those Turkic countries, you know. I mean, is he going to let the Turkic people, you know, run the show as well as the white Russians?
Well, he doesn't have much heft to oppose them. I suppose he could leverage Russian military support when there are rebellions against the elite, but I don't see any racial angle on this. Okay, so I'm going to have to get to clinic.
Would you make me the host? Because you stopped